Latino political power in the United States keeps growing. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the conversation. I'm David Schuster. The incoming Congress is going to be historic for many reasons, in part because it will have the highest number of Latino lawmakers in Congress in US history. Here to talk about that is Christian Paz. He's a senior political reporter for Vox. Christian, thanks for joining us. First of all, how did this happen?
Yeah, thank you for having me, David. The way that this happened is both because of the number of historic number of vacancies of open seats that were open in this election cycle. I think one of the findings from a lot of political scientists and political theory is that one of the best ways to increase diversity, whether it's racial diversity or gender diversity, is through having open seats, incumbents who choose not to run. And in many of those places, we had large Latino populations. That is true in Texas, that's true in California, places that sent new members and that will be increasing some of the diversity that Congress has. And also in some places that weren't expected, you wouldn't expect to necessarily have large Latino populations. Places like Oregon or Washington State, where we did have some firsts being made, and where we did have some of the party, the Democratic Party specifically, backing candidates and helping them out in tough races.
34 incumbent Latino lawmakers and then 14 new lawmakers Latino who just got elected. This means something like 11% of the US House will be Latino. What sort of impact does that have in terms of legislative priorities and the agenda?
Yeah, so for this story, I talked to a handful of these freshmen, of these incoming members, and each of them provided a different kind of list of priorities that they're going to bring to the House. Part of the point of having more diversity in Congress is that you have new stories and new experiences represented at the highest levels of power, and that by having people in the room who've had those diverse experiences, you're able to better advocate for and build coalitions for some of these topics. So for example, I talked to Rob Garcia from California. He is one of the new members, and he's an immigrant who was born in Peru. He is one of the first immigrants that will be elected again, but also what makes him more different is that he's also gay. So he's the first gay immigrant elected to Congress. When I talked to him a little bit about some of the priorities that he's going to have, he obviously talked a lot about immigration reform, and the hopes for that aren't necessarily great because we'll have divided government, but he said that he hopes to bring some new experiences to the table and talk to folks across the aisle, Republicans, about places that there can be cooperation on. He knows that it's impossible to make a big promise about big reforms being able to be made in the next Congress, but still it's important to have somebody advocating and providing perhaps a different perspective on something like immigration reform. Another case is if you look to Illinois. You look at Delia Ramirez. She was elected outside of the Chicago area, and she talked to me a lot about mental health. This didn't make it up to the story, but was a very poignant moment that we talked about over the phone. Was her own struggles with mental health growing up, and how a lot of members of Congress aren't necessarily open about some of those experiences. And that matters when you look at some of the legislation that might come up in the next Congress when it comes to funding for, gun violence prevention programs and other policy or propositions that might be helpful in trying to combat some of the root causes for some of this violence.
And then, of course, there might be something about affordable housing, given all the attention that Maxwell Alejandro Frost brought to it, given that he couldn't find housing. He's 25 years old, youngest member of Congress, and he was denied for his first apartment that he tried to get because, I guess, of credit rating.
Yeah, I chatted with Maxwell too, and I think we chatted before this happened, before he tweeted about this. But this is also a very, very clear and obvious example of something that happens to a lot of Americans, a lot of younger Americans too, and a kind of story that isn't necessarily told at the highest levels of power. And having somebody from that younger generation, from Generation Z, he'll be the first from that generation to join Congress. Adds another layer to the conversation that we have about affordability, that we have about cost of living, and that we have about the role that government can play in trying to combat some of those, bread and butter issues that people were worried about going into the election, but perhaps didn't necessarily, feel represented in some of the political discourse that politicians have.
And speaking of representation, a lot of people think, oh my God, the Latino community, they must be fairly monolithic in terms of their concerns and priorities. But as you found, it's actually a very diverse population, a very diverse set of political interests.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big themes of this election and the campaign season was whether or not Latino voters would shift to Republicans in large numbers, or whether Democrats would be able to hang on to the support that they've traditionally had among Latinos. And we did see that there were places where there was, Republican overperformance with Latino voters. Most obvious case is Florida. But there are other states where, both because of strategists and campaigns deciding to dedicate more resources to turning out Latino voters, thinking specifically of Pennsylvania, for example, you did see very strong loyalty from this group of voters for Democratic candidates, specifically for John Fetterman, the Senate race, that proved incredibly important to making sure that he had that big win over Mehmet Oz. But I think what we saw really in this election is that there is a lot of variance when you look at specific states and specific communities. For example, the Southwest was another great example of a place that kind of defied the expectation that Latinos would, defect from Democratic candidates in big numbers. You did see Senator Cortez Masto win re-election in Nevada with a very large number of, very large margin of Democratic support that she needed to beat Adam Laxalt there. And then the same was true in Arizona, where you do have a younger generation of Latinos who are, mobilizing, entering the electorate, and need to be reached by these campaigns. And one of those campaigns obviously did it better in the Senate race. And that was, one of the main reasons that we had a more decisive victory there. But yeah, big trend to continue watching.
And you mentioned allegiance to the Democrats, whether it's Nevada or Arizona or Pennsylvania. What was the most successful message? And maybe it's the Fetterman campaign, but was there one particular theme that these candidates put forward, both to sort of organize Latinos and to make sure Latinos showed up and voted for Democrats?
Yeah, the message really varied a lot. It depended on, how powerful of a message or how powerful of an influence abortion rights messaging had, for example, in Nevada, where Senator Cortez Masto made a big effort to play up why she's a champion for abortion rights, to shore up that support among Latino voters who ranked it as an important concern. The same was true in Arizona, where there was, a lot of tension over whether a decades-old law would go into effect after the overturn of Roe. And there was some legal disagreement at the state level, and provided an opening for Senator Mark Kelly to be able to make that message about how he would stand in there and be an advocate and stop and provide obstacles to Republicans. But one of the other things that came up constantly in polling was that candidates needed to have a strong economic message, whether that's the progressive populism that some candidates like John Fetterman have advocated for before, or whether it was, talking, hearing, just listening to concerns that people had about inflation. That is something that came across in my conversations with some of these incoming House members too, that, they had to make clear that they are one vote out of 500 if you look at the whole of Congress. And it's very little that one individual person can do, but that they're required, it's required to have at least, laying the groundwork for building a majority again in the future, to be able to make those reforms or pass policies and can try to lower the cost of living. And that was really important. If you weren't talking about, or at least acknowledging some of the economic pain that Latino voters were feeling, you wouldn't get very far.
The unemployment rate when Joe Biden took office was 6.6%. It's now down to 3.7%. Is that one of the things that perhaps helped Latinos sort of stay in the Democratic column? And maybe that's a reflection on Joe Biden's stewardship of the economy.
Yeah, there's definitely a strong case that was being made when you explain some of the track record that Democrats had in the majority when it came to the economy. That was something that I heard a lot in Nevada, that folks could identify some things that the government was doing to try to improve their lives. Perhaps in Nevada, you look specifically at the effect that pandemic shutdowns had within Las Vegas, specifically Clark County, where there was, according to some numbers that are more coming out right now, a slight decline in Democratic support within that specific county. Republicans, I think, had in general, as was true because it was, was supposed to be a red wave. So Republicans did turn out. The truth was that Republicans turned out, but voted for Democrats still. And the same was true for even conservative Latinos in that state. And when you did talk about the difference, the distinction between what the federal government can do and what the state government was able to do, you could make a bolder and more aggressive case for voting for Democrats.
You mentioned the divided government. The Republicans are going to have control of the House. A lot of these Latino lawmakers are in the Democratic minority. But is there a particular issue, a particular item that they feel optimistic that they can get some sort of bipartisan support, and even with a Republican House, get it through the House chamber?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of optimism on immigration and still some sense that there are enough moderate or conventional Republicans in the House that, would be willing to walk the talk when it comes to border security and strike a deal on some kind of protection for Dreamers, for example. There's no denying that, things will be difficult, and folks know that, but they think that it's important to at least try to build those connections and build those coalitions in Congress to perhaps take it up again when you look at the next, 2024, the next election.
And I got to imagine that just, never mind the specifics of policy. I mean, in the Latino community, there must just be such an enormous sense of pride to have this level of representation in Congress.
There definitely is. And I think this is true when you look at specific candidates and you talk to voters in their districts, and they know that some of these folks are making history. And there's a lot of pride for the fact that there is greater representation, and that as the community in general across the country is growing and is aging into the electorate and is, the largest minority voting bloc in the country, that there is a representation of them in federal government. That is something that is newer. And in a lot of places, for example, I call out Washington and Oregon because you wouldn't expect there to be just such a large community of Latinos there, but there is, and they are electing members to Congress.
It is a remarkable story. Christian Paz, senior politics reporter for Vox. Christian, thanks for doing this. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.